And yeah, thanks everyone for coming. I'm really excited to share some still initial results, but to share what we've been doing on this SE-CASC funded work, looking at projecting bird habitat and climate impacts on birds in the Southern Appalachians. Just wanted to share who I am real quick. Mara gave a great introduction. So I'm right now working in with Rob Scheller in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources at NC State. And I was a SE-CASC Global Change Fellow in 2020, so I'm excited to be back in as a postdoc now instead of a student. And my research focuses are really on vegetation dynamics and disturbance. So here's me and my PhD doing a disturbance. But I'm also, in a previous life, was a bird researcher. So here's me as a baby going out to measure some nests of southwestern willow flycatcher. So I'm excited this project to bring together two really big interests of mine. And so I'll jump right into it. So this work is being done in the Appalachians, and the Appalachians have seen a huge amount of change in the last several centuries, but especially since the early 1900s, we've seen big changes in land use, agricultural abandonment, changes in forest management. So these forests are all recovering from historical clearance and logging. We've also seen big changes in the disturbance regimes. So fire was historically a large part of a lot of the Appalachians. It has been suppressed pretty effectively recently. So we've seen changes in species composition from that with more fire-sensitive species coming in. But we've also seen during really severe drought years, these big mega fires like the Chimney Tops 2 fire that was driven by severe fire weather and really strong winds. We've also seen huge impacts from pests and pathogens. I mean, the loss of the American chestnut has made these forests essentially a totally different kind of forest than what was there 200 years ago. And recently we've seen the hemlock woolly adelgid wiping out another foundational species in the Appalachians. So all these changes are going to have really big impacts on the wildlife of the Appalachians. And it's not all negative. We've also seen shifts towards conservation with a focus on our public lands towards a more mixed use and really including wildlife habitat as an objective in land management. But all these changes are likely to have legacies that last into the future under climate change. The Appalachians are a super diverse place, so they support a wide variety of climates and vegetation types, from moist cove forests on really rich sites to essentially arid, rocky table mountain pine stands. We've got spruce fir at high elevation. We've got different ages of forests, so patches of early successional habitat mixed in with mature forest. And this huge diversity in climatic conditions and vegetation conditions also support a wide variety of wildlife. So there's dozens of forest birds that breed in the Appalachians, and a lot of them have been declining in recent decades. These are a few, but there's dozens of species that are on lists of state special concern or greatest conservation need. Here we're going to focus on two of them, the cerulean warbler and golden-winged warbler. They've both been really steeply declining in recent decades, especially in the Appalachians. The golden-winged might only have 10,000 individuals left in the Southern Appalachians. And they have really contrasting habitat needs. So the cerulean is really a bird of tall, mature forest. And the golden-winged it's a deciduous forest bird, but it needs open shrubby habitat for nesting. So it really needs early successional habitat, heterogeneous forest conditions. So these are the two we're going to be focusing on for this talk as really emblematic of two different habitat conditions. So as well as those huge changes in management and vegetation structure that I mentioned before, these birds are also likely to be vulnerable to climate change. So the kinds of, this is a product created by Audubon, where each of these bars is a species, and the ones in red are ones where climate change is likely to lead to a reduction in range. The birds we're interested in fall into the boreal forest category. So the southern Appalachians are the southern extent of a lot of northern birds that are able to make it down at higher elevations in the southern Appalachians. So a lot of these birds are going to be threatened by climate change as that climatic niche at the tops of those mountains is lost. And a lot of eastern forest birds also. So this is where cerulean and our golden wing would fall in. But these sorts of models are based mostly on just the climatic niche of where the birds are found. So what kind of climate are they found in now? What's the climate look like into the future? But the situation's going to be a little more complicated than that, in that these birds also have vegetation composition and structure needs to make good habitat for them. And those vegetative variables aren't going to track climate directly. A lot of times they're going to lag climate. Especially, it's easiest to think about this with trees that are really long-lived. And of course, they can grow, a lot of trees can grow outside of the climatic conditions in which they were originally found. A lot of the landscaping that people have are trees that are growing totally outside of their natural range, right? So they're able to persist in a place that might not have a suitable climate until a disturbance or something knocks out those long-lived trees, and then the replacement vegetation might more closely match climate. So in order to project and manage for habitat for these birds, we need some way to keep track of this dynamic vegetation and its relationship with climate, and how disturbance and management will interact with the vegetation structure. And all of that leads to greater uncertainty in what the climate change vulnerability will look like for these birds. Just to put this in cartoon form, I drew a beautiful mountain here. This is a mountain with a sort of mid-elevation band that has suitable climate for a particular bird. There's also patches of habitat that have suitable vegetation structure. So say these might be early successional habitat patches that a bird needs. And some of those patches overlap with the suitable climate, and those might support populations of birds. In the future, we expect under a warming climate, that band of suitable climate to move upslope, and there may or may not be habitat patches there. If there are patches that are suitable and the climate's right, then those that'll allow those populations to move upslope and support a stable population. However, that vegetation isn't likely to be static. So we could see, say, a reduction in early successional habitat as those patches fill in with mature forests, something like that. And so those may or may not overlap with suitable climate into the future, leading to reductions in population. It's especially important when we're thinking about how to manage for increasing habitat for these species. So, if we're using silviculture or something to add a patch of habitat, where do we put it? When should we put it? And how long is it likely to be effective? All of these things require sort of dynamic vegetation modeling approach. So the overall questions that this project is asking are, well, the first sort of overarching question is, how do we expect the habitat for these birds to change under climate change, which is a pretty big question. So we can break that down into some smaller chunks. We can look at how do vegetation dynamics in particular affect the way that habitat responds to climate change. We can look at the role of disturbance, which is likely to change in the future. And then the sort of most important, the culmination of this project is using all this information to inform how we can manage for habitat for these birds into the future. I've got another cartoon. This is sort of the overall goal of the project, is linking climate change to habitat change. This arrow is doing a lot of work. We can swap that out with some more details. So we can use something called a species distribution model. This is a statistical model that links environmental conditions to to the abundance or occurrence of a species. But of course, we're also interested in how vegetation is going to change with climate change and how that interacts with habitat conditions. So we need another model of vegetation quality. And we can swap that out with the kind of model we're going to be using, which is a forest landscape model, which tracks vegetation conditions across a full landscape instead of an individual stand, and allows us to look at broader scale changes on the landscape. It also allows us to incorporate management scenarios. So one of the major goals of this project is to co-develop different management portfolios with our partners and agencies and nonprofits, and try to look for trade-offs and co-benefits in the future, and optimize where and how to plan those management treatments. Our study area, there's two study areas here really. Our first study area is the whole Appalachians from Alabama to the Catskills in New York, essentially. This is Bird Conservation Region 28, and it's also the boundary for the Appalachian Mountain Joint Venture, which is a collaboration of agencies and nonprofits and other organizations to improve management for these birds of conservation need. The forest landscape model we're using is much more detailed, and so we have to restrict the area we can run it on. So we're just going to do this in the Southern Blue Ridge area here. It's this island of green between the valley and ridge and the Piedmont. It's an area with a lot of public land that has been managed for various purposes, but a lot of it supports intact, high quality forest habitat. So it's sort of a refuge for a lot of these eastern forest birds. So the first part of this is using the forest landscape model to generate projections of the future landscape. So we can swap this forest landscape model out with the specific model we're using, which I'll describe in a second. So this Landis 2 vegetation model, forest landscape model. And we can use that to create different, using different scenarios of climate and management, different projections of future habitat conditions. So Landis 2 there's a lot that goes on in this model, but in broad strokes, it's a cell-based model. You can see each of these little dots. Within each one of these dots, there's a stack of trees, like a set of trees that grow. They compete with each other for resources. They grow and reproduce and die. And then within each site, we track a whole bunch of ecosystem variables. So there's a hydrologic model, there's a soil carbon model, and all of that allows us to look at really important ecosystem processes like carbon stocks and fluxes, leaf area, soil moisture, and water deficits. So that allows us to get a really mechanistic picture of the sorts of drivers of habitat quality into the future, and link those to our habitat models. Landis is also really good at modeling disturbance. It's sort of its specialty. It's the DI in Landis. So here we're modeling fire, including prescribed fire, different harvest regimes. So that could be commercial harvesting and also silvicultural treatments for improving bird habitat, and pests and pathogens. So this is a bark beetle. We're also modeling the hemlock woolly adelgid. And then two climate scenarios. This one with this little thermometer, this is the mildest RCP 8.5 scenario here, with about 3 degrees of warming. And then when you see this icon, this is the hottest scenario in the Appalachians. It also includes a lot of variability between years. So there's some really dry drought years. So we'll be using these two scenarios indicated by these icons. So the initial landscape of this model, we're looking at biomass across the landscape, just sort of the core of what the model is tracking. And it's really heterogeneous because the Appalachians are really heterogeneous. We've got these really high biomass areas. This is this core of the Smokies. This is temperate rainforest, essentially. And also, a more of a working forest landscape with more fragmentation and more variety in age. when we run the model over time, we can let the trees do what they're simulated to be doing, and look at how biomass changes under this milder scenario. We see on average we lose about 2 tons per hectare across the landscape, but it's really patchy. There's areas where we gain biomass, areas where we lose biomass. And the picture is similar under this hotter scenario. We lose a little bit more biomass on average, as trees are less able to recover from disturbances. You can also look at the species composition, which has a big impact on bird habitat. So here's the initial landscape, the proportion of the biomass that is oak or hickory biomass, and we can see patches where it's almost entirely dominated by oak hickory, areas where it's going to be more coniferous or say a co-forest with a lot of tulip poplar. And the species composition also changes over time. We have areas where we gain some oak hickory, areas where we lose some. It's a similar picture under the hotter climate scenario. Now, a lot of this is driven by disturbance. So oak and hickory have recently been declining in a lot of places because of a lack of fire, which allows red maple and tulip poplar and other trees to dominate the site and prevent oak and hickory establishment. So the disturbance regimes also are likely to change under these different scenarios. So this is a picture of the Chimney Tops 2 fire, which in 2016 burned from Smokies all the way into Gatlinburg. And under this hotter climate change scenario, we see a huge increase in fire frequency compared to this milder scenario. And a lot of these areas in darker red here are areas where we saw more oak and hickory in the model. So there's a lot going into this, but using these landscape projections, we can then translate those to bird habitat projections. So that's what this next part will focus on. So we've got our model here of the workflow, and now we can plug in our species distribution model. So for this, we used a boosted regression tree, which is it's a machine learning method that allows us to estimate the probability of observing a bird in a particular site based on these different habitat variables. So a lot of these are normal sort of land cover, species composition, topography, and climate. I want to highlight these 2 variables. One, we're using eBird data as our bird occurrence records, and we incorporated vegetation structure information using spaceborne LiDAR. Here again is our study area. So here for these SDMs, we're looking at this full Appalachian mountain study area. So eBird is it's a citizen science project that essentially it leverages birders' need to take notes to produce a really valuable data set. So it's essentially just a collection of checklists that people have taken as they've been out birding, and they upload it to eBird. It's a huge data set with a really amazing temporal and spatial coverage. It also includes effort information, so we can separate presences and absences, which a lot of data sets, distributed data sets don't allow you to do. So after we take 115,000 records and thin them spatially and temporally to avoid spatial biases, we get a map like this with places where Australian warblers are present, places where they're absent, and you can see some spatial patterns here that will align with environmental differences. It allows us to train this model. To measure vegetation, we used a really new data set from spaceborne LiDAR. This is the JEDI sensor. It's installed on the International Space Station. And as the ISS flies over, it emits light from the sensor and then measures how long it takes to reflect back, essentially. And based on that, you can measure the vertical distribution of vegetation at a site. So here's what it looks like as the ISS flies over. It's recording these parallel bands, so you get this sort of hatched mark look from the sensor. And if we zoom in on one of these, this is a place where Australian warbler was absent or present, a buffer around that point. we can see what this looks like. So we can measure things like biomass at the site, vegetation biomass. So some areas have a lot, some have less. Water has no biomass. We can also look at the distribution of vegetation within that snapshot, within that cell. And so we can look at the diversity of vegetation. We can look at how much understory there is. And so now using this model, we can tackle some of these questions that I introduced earlier. First, let's just look at overall trends of how we think habitat will change under climate change. Our first example will be cerulean warblers. Again, these are birds that prefer high canopies with emergent trees. They're mature deciduous forest birds. And so what we expect to see is a preference for high biomass deciduous forests on rich sites. So the way this species distribution model works is it ranks different variables based on their importance, how much influence they had over whether the bird was observed or not. And they're also able to capture nonlinear responses. So here's our most important variable for determining cerulean warbler presence is how much deciduous forest there is within a buffer around the observation. And you can see under places with more deciduous forests, we have a higher odds of observing a cerulean warbler. So this matches what we expect. We also see the second most important variable is how much understory is there. So places with less understory vegetation are more likely to have cerulean warblers. They also prefer, these are 3, 4, and 5 most important variables, steeper slopes, higher biomass, and areas with more soil moisture. And so this, it seems like this model has really captured what we expect are the most important determinants of where cerulean warblers are found in a way that we can link directly to our forest landscape model. When we map what that distribution looks like, we get the sort of core of cerulean warbler habitat in West Virginia and like Cumberland area, then some into the Blue Ridge, and then a little more up in further north in the Appalachians. And we can compare that to some other products. Here's an example from the Climate Change Bird Atlas, which is made using a completely different set of methods. And we can see we're broadly getting the shape of the distribution. I think our model is a little optimistic right now, but it's we're still tuning the model and working on improving it. So this might be more of a map of potential habitat area rather than where the bird is actually found. So the whole plan here is to take this model and apply it to that forest landscape model and see what habitat will look like into the future. This is what it looks like at the beginning of the model run. We run the model out for 60 years and incorporate all those changes in biomass and species composition that I showed before. And this is what our model looks like in 2080 under this milder climate change scenario. It looks pretty good. We see an increase in habitat pretty much across the board. And a lot of this is driven by forest aging. So older forests with less understory vegetation just have more appropriate structure for ceruleans. And so it seems like ceruleans might benefit from forest maturation more than they lose out to warming. So this is potentially a really positive trajectory for this bird that needs mature forest. Our next example is our golden wing warblers. And again, they need deciduous forest. They're mostly a deciduous forest bird, but their nesting habitat requires open shrub-dominated areas. And they've been really steeply declining, especially in the Appalachians. So these are a bird of really high concern, especially to state governments. So for the golden winged, we get a completely different set of predictors. Here's our most important one, is maximum temperature in the summer. We get a really sharp threshold. We also have minimum temperature. It's also important. It also has a threshold effect. And these two variables determine the elevational range of the golden winged warbler. So these guys are well known to have a pretty narrow band of elevations they're found at. And that in this model is determined by temperature. They're bracketed between these two thresholded variables. They also need deciduous forest, but in contrast to ceruleans, they prefer areas with less biomass. So this is how the model is able to capture that need for early successional deciduous forest habitat. I also included here the third most important variable is it's just a control variable for effort. So the longer you're out looking for golden winged, the more likely you are to find one. But this is how effort is included in the model also. If we compare this distribution to the climate change bird atlas, we see almost a one-to-one correspondence, except we have a little more habitat up here in like Delaware Water Gap area. But these two models, based on totally different data sets and methods, are in large agreement on what makes good golden winged habitat. The differences are worth looking into as we revise these models. So if you project the distribution of golden wings or their habitat quality into the future, this is what we're starting from. By 2080, we see big losses throughout their range in the southern Blue Ridge. And if we run this same scenario under so it seems like these birds are not going to benefit from the natural successional processes like ceruleans did, and might require more active intervention to maintain habitat quality for them. The situation's even worse if we use that hotter climate change scenario, in which case there's almost no habitat left for them in the southern Blue Ridge. So it seems like golden wings in particular, and probably other species too, are going to be sensitive to what the climate ends up looking like in the future. So there's a lot of model uncertainty here, due to which trajectory we end up on for emissions and warming. So we can start to answer this first question. It seems like the habitat changes are really going to depend on the species we're looking at and their habitat needs, and also the uncertainty in climate change projections. We can get a little more specific. So I suggested that the cerulean warblers were going to benefit from changes in vegetation even as the climate became less suitable for them. So we can look more specifically at that using this approach. Here our axes are, or the color ramp. Blue colors mean the habitat increased in quality from 2020 to 2080, and red means it decreased. And so we can separate out the effect just of climate by using those models and then generating predictions where the vegetation remained constant, the vegetation remained unchanging from 2020 to 2080, and the climate warmed. And we see generally decreases everywhere due to the effect of climate. So the climate makes habitat less suitable for cerulean warblers. If we do the same thing in the other direction, we keep the climate constant but allow the vegetation to change, we see a big increase in habitat quality, especially in the southern part of the study area. And so this highlights the importance of separating these different elements of what makes for habitat. And it seems like if we can shepherd our forests towards a more mature state, leverage natural successional processes, that might really improve habitat for these birds in the future. And this mirrors current trajectories in at least for wood thrush, which has similar habitat requirements. They've actually been doing really well in the southern Appalachians recently. A lot of that overlaps with efforts to improve habitat for these mature forest birds. And so hopefully this is a continuation of a trajectory that's already positive. We can do a similar analysis for golden wings. Look at the effect of climate, and it's negative pretty much across the board, going from 2020 to 2080. If we look at the effect of vegetation change, it's also mostly negative. There are some gains at these lower elevations. That's likely due to fire. Increases in fire frequency under a hotter climate. But in the sort of core of their current distribution, we see declines as we lose some of that early successional habitat. So this is my hunch is it's driven by disturbance. We got to dig in a little deeper to the analysis to figure this out and help see if that can help us plan for managing for better habitat for golden wings. So we can start to answer the next question here. Vegetation dynamics seem like they're going to be a really important element of forecasting potential habitat for these birds in the future, which is a challenge because it's a difficult that's a difficult task. It requires a lot of data, and it requires pretty careful thought about how we're representing the ecology of these birds. But it's also potentially really beneficial because we can influence vegetation structure using management. So we saw that disturbance regimes are likely to change under climate change. And so we can also use these models to try to explore how we expect those changes in disturbance to affect habitat quality. So because golden wings they require early successional habitat, which historically would have been maintained by fire, either lightning ignited or through human land management before European arrival. We might expect climate change associated increases in wildfire frequency to open up more habitat for golden wings. So we can test this out using the forest landscape model by running experiments. So we can just turn off wildfire and see what happens. Again, we have blue being habitat gain and red being loss. In this case, we're comparing a scenario with no wildfire to a scenario that includes wildfire. And here's what we get. It's a real patchwork, and the effects are really small. So on average, turning off wildfire has no effect on golden winged warbler habitat. It improves in some places, it gets worse in others, but it's kind of a wash. And this is my hypothesis for why we see this effect, is that fire is suppressed for too long that now even the fire sensitive trees are too big for low intensity wildfires to kill. So our encroaching maples and tulip poplars and trees like that they're just too old. And so we're gonna need likely either increase in severity of wildfire. So there might be patches here that are higher severity that might support early cereal habitat. But I think more likely we're going to need to use silviculture to sort of reset these stands and allow fire to be able to do its job. So this brings us to the most important part of the project, and the part that is the hardest and that we haven't gotten a chance to really dig into quite yet, which is how can we inform management with these models? We have a lot of capacity from these models to investigate different hypotheses and try different scenarios out. And so the goal is to use those to learn how to prioritize management. One thing we can do is to look for refugia. So these are places where the habitat is currently good, and we think it's going to keep being good into the future. So for ceruleans, we actually see a pretty big area of contiguous patches that are likely to be refugia. So these are places we can prioritize maintaining good habitat structure in these areas. For golden wings, we see fewer refugia, and they're also more scattered. So here we might have to be a lot more active in creating habitat through active management. So for golden wings, the refugia typically are places with lower temperatures. They're places with more precipitation, and they're places that receive less insulation. So these are higher elevation, moist, north-facing slopes. These are rich sites, and this is well known as being what they want for their post-nesting habitat. So I think an important part of managing for these birds is going to be increasing the heterogeneity of vegetation structure in these sorts of areas. yeah, to maintain the proper vegetation structure in these refugia. One tool that's widely applied in the Southeast is prescribed fire. So shrub nesting birds, these and teal, are more likely to be found in areas that burned versus unburned areas. And they're also likely to be found in areas that burned at higher severity. So this yellow line compared to the blue line that burned at low severity. So as I'm starting to explore these management scenarios within the model, one idea is just to bump up the amount of prescribed fire. So I tripled the amount of prescribed fire we're applying and allowed them to burn hotter to try and increase the prescribed fire's impact on the canopy. And we see a lot of blue here. These are places where adding extra prescribed fire improved habitat quality. But there's also plenty of places where it didn't. And so it seems like we can use this high intensity management to create small habitat patches, but we're gonna have to target it more precisely in places where we think it'll have an effect. The other really major way that we manage for increasing habitat for these birds is using silviculture. So here's some examples from Appalachian Mountain Joint Venture on some mid-story treatments for improving wood thrush habitat and some open habitat for golden-winged warblers. So this is the next goal of the project is, how can we include that those factors in our management scenarios? And so we'll be working really closely with our partners to develop those scenarios, and I'll have more about that in a second here. So using this whole approach with the forest landscape modeling and the species distribution modeling, I think what we've seen so far is that it's going to be really important to be able to represent future vegetation conditions somehow, because for some species, that's the real driver of change in their habitat. For others, they're more sensitive directly to climate. And so finding the balance of those and being able to represent those processes will be really important for planning, for managing these birds. We can also use these models to help align management with places where the climate is going to be beneficial. So using those refugia to help target treatments. And hopefully leveraging natural disturbances and natural succession where we can to help accentuate our management efforts. So our next step in this modeling is to include different management portfolios developed, like co-produced with our partners. These are some examples of scenarios we've considered that I'm working on building and working on first drafts of. We have our current forest plan and sort of business as usual private forest management. We might have another scenario that's really focused on increasing heterogeneity of age structure, so trying to have mature forests, but also some early successional habitat. Another scenario that might be, so the majority of the land in the Southern Blue Ridge is privately owned. There's a lot of efforts to engage private landowners on managing their forests for birds of conservation concern. So we can simulate that within the model. And then we can also use the model to design the management scenarios. So placing treatment in the refugia where we expect it to be most effective. And we can help prioritize and optimize management using these methods. We're also planning on including a whole suite of birds of conservation concern. So there's dozens of birds of conservation need in the states that neighbor our study area. So we've developed a sort of mostly automated workflow to pull in data from eBird and then our predictor information from Google Earth Engine and build these models in a mostly automated way. So this next step, I'm really excited to bring all these together and look for trade-offs and co-benefits among different bird species. Are there umbrella species that benefit the whole suite of other birds? These sorts of questions that we can tackle by increasing the number of birds we're working with. I'll be choosing these all with our agency and nonprofit partners. We're also planning on building on some work that Tina Mazalewski, she was also a Global Change Fellow, did in the Piedmont and looking at connectivity among habitat patches. So here's our golden wings. You can see they're really dispersed little patches of habitat. And especially golden wings have a really high site fidelity. So, they can fly wherever they want. They fly all the way to South America every year, but they'll return to essentially the same spot that they were born. Um, and so this fragmented habitat landscape makes it harder for them to colonize new sites that might be beneficial. And so we can use a connectivity analysis to look at connections between different sites and help plan, plan treatments to increase habitat that improves connectivity among patches. So with that, I'd like to thank a whole bunch of people. My lab mates in the Dynamic Ecosystems and Landscapes lab, and Rob Scheller, who's PI of the lab. Folks who worked on the Landis 2 model, Zachary Robbins, Kate Jones, and Katie McQuillan especially, and Tina Mazalewski, who's we've also worked with on these models. Folks, partners in agencies and nonprofits who we're working with to develop management scenarios and fine-tune our bird habitat models. And of course, the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center for funding this work. And yeah, I'd love to take any questions. I also want to encourage people to reach out.